Today, I'm going to be talking to award-winning author Joseph Wambaugh. A former 14 years member of the Los Angeles Police Department, Joe has written 18 books, both fiction and nonfiction, created screenplays and a TV miniseries, and was creator and consultant for 2 television series. His latest novel, Hollywood Moon, which we will talk about later in the broadcast, will be released December 2nd of this year by Little Brown and Company Publishers. Joe, welcome to my first show, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm honored to be here, Jacqueline. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Joe, let's get right to it and begin about talking about your first 2 fiction books. The New Centurions, about 5 cops and their life on the force, which was published in 1971, and The Blue Knight, about a cop on the beat and the problems he encounters, published in 1972, while you were still with the LA Police Force. They established your reputation as a powerful writer who captured the dynamics of the city of LA and its police force. Joe, what was different about these books that resonated with readers and critics?
Oh, I think it was that I was less interested in how the cops act on the job, which is something that police procedurals always did. They told, how a cop did police work. I was more interested in how the job acts on the cop. Mm-hmm. Therefore, mine became more psychological novels about the world of the police, and hence a lot of people said that I'm the father of the modern police novel. Since then, people have become very interested in post-traumatic stress syndrome and things like that as it affects police officers. And back in my day, that was unheard of.
Well, I'm sure that's very true, and I would tend to agree that you are the father of the modern police novel. In 1973, you turned to nonfiction with The Onion Field, a book that many say is your most important work, and of which you said was personally important for you to write. Tell us why it was important, and why don't you describe how the work differed from writing novels?
Well, once again, I was more interested in how the job acts on the cop, and I was still on the LAPD when the kidnapping of officers Ian Campbell and Carl Hedinger occurred in Hollywood, and by 2 small-time robbers, and the officers were taken to an onion field in Bakersfield, California, thinking that the criminals just wanted to escape, but the robbers intended to murder them. And Ian Campbell was murdered, and Carl Hedinger escaped by running through the onion fields. Well, that was interesting in itself, of course, and horrible. Never in the history of LAPD, and perhaps in most of Southern California, had an officer ever been kidnapped like that and then executed. So, of course, it was a big event with our police department. But when I became interested, as a budding writer, I didn't know I was a writer yet when that occurred in 1963, but maybe inside of me, I was hoping someday to try to put things down on paper. I became interested in the surviving officer, Carl Hedinger, and how he was dragged through roll calls, assemblies of cops, and told how by surrendering his weapon when one of the robbers had a gun in his partner's back, he had made the wrong choice. That's what he was forced to do. Then I saw him in subsequent years on the police department, and he looked like a haunted man. I would see him roaming around Parker Center downtown when he had a job of driving for the chief of police at that time. And he was eventually involved in a series of shoplifting, crazy things. And once again, I became interested in that. Why would he do that? And could this possibly be guilt, overwhelming guilt, crying out for punishment? He was caught, and he was fired from the police department in disgrace. And I thought, someday, if I ever become a writer, I want to find out how the job acted on that man. I want to find out why he became a petty thief obviously trying to be caught.
Well,
how he wanted to be punished, and that drove me for a long time.
Well, it was a fantastic book. It was really great. And this is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, Progressive Radio, 1340 AM, KPTR, and I'm talking to author Joseph Wambaugh. Joe, after leaving the police force, you returned to the novel with the Choirboys, released in 1975. Now, that's about 5 policemen, their on-the-job experience, and their attempt to unwind in after hours. While fiction, every happening is true, you called this book a turning point as an author. Tell us a little bit about how your writing process and style developed and changed with the freedom of being out of the police system, and why did you call this book a turning point?
Yeah, leaving the police department set me free as a novelist. When I wrote The Onion Field, that was nonfiction. That was true. I was a journalist. I was an investigative reporter when I wrote that book, in essence, even though I was still a cop. But when I wrote The Choirboys, I developed a voice that I hadn't had before. It was kind of, it was a satiric voice. It was ironic. It was my story was full of gallows humor, dark humor, which I used to tell a serious story, much like Joseph Heller did in his war novel Catch-22, or in Slaughterhouse-5 by Kurt Vonnegut. They used dark comedy to tell a serious war story. Well, I did the same thing, and my war story was a police story. And I used that dark humor. And choir practice referred. I didn't invent the term. It referred to the habit of some with LAPD who would go off and unwind and drink after work, and they called it choir practice. Hence the title, The Choirboys. Well, in any case, I developed a new kind of voice to tell a serious story. And, it's full of very dark, macabre humor.
Well, it is. And did that process of writing that book then affect all of your future writing?
Yes, all of my subsequent writings after Choirboys involve gallows humor.
Yes. Well, you then went on later to write the screenplay for the movie version of The Onion Field, released in 1979. Tell us what that experience did for your writing skills.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I wished that I had written screenplay before I'd written the book, and all of my books since then, I felt the same way. I wish I had written a screenplay, because writing a screenplay forces one to be economical and not to waste a lot of language to make the story move and go from sequence to sequence quickly and not linger. The pace is so important that's very helpful for a novelist in writing a book. So that taught me a lot. I had, of course, the wonderful experience and the terrifying experience of financing a movie with the money of all of my friends and our own money, and anybody else who I could solicit, including cops, and everyone agreed to work for a pittance. I worked for nothing, and decided that if the movie ever made a profit, then I would get money for my services, including my screenwriting, my book rights, and etc., my production work. And we had $2.3 million. Which was a lot in those days in terms of making a small budget movie.
Absolutely.
But if we had failed, we had no studio behind us at all. We would have had the world's most expensive home movie.
Well, you sure would have. So that was your experience in show business then, in that first version. I know you did go on later to do other screenplays, and we'll talk about that in a minute. By the time your name as an author had become synonymous with, by that time, your name as an author had become synonymous with Los Angeles. But beginning with your 1978 novel, The Black Marble, you began to broaden the settings to include communities outside of L.A. The change of scenery seemed to begin in earnest about 1984, with your fiction taking place in spots like Newport Beach, Palm Springs, San Diego. Since you've described your work as character-driven, Tell us how a geographical change might have affected your characters in your novel.
You know, I don't think the geography did affect the characters. I think I still work the same way because people are people wherever they are. A few years after that, as you know, I went to England to write a book. So I think that people are basically the same all over. Hence, cops in Europe and in Latin America and even in Russia, everywhere else, where they've had a chance to read my books, identify with the police officers that I've written about. And I get letters from all over the world from cops saying, oh, that's just like the guys I work with. You know, that reminds me of what happened to us, and that sort of thing. So that means I guess I've got my finger on the pulse of police officers anyway.
So have your books been published in other languages?
Oh, sure, yeah, lots of them.
Well, that's great. So you're world known, not just nationally.
Well, the first time I went to the Soviet Union in the mid-'70s with my family, it was really ironic. We were in Moscow, and a cab driver was introduced to me by our translator, guide, as the author of the new Centurions, and he got very excited. And I said, "But my books aren't." At that time, I said, "My books are not translated in Russian." And she said, "Well, this was during the Cold War." She said, "Yes, but during our Easter." The chairman of the Communist Party decided that they would show a popular Western movie on Easter all day long in all the movie theaters in Moscow to keep people from going to church.
Oh,
and the movie they showed was The New Centurions.
That's fabulous.
So I was suddenly famous in Russia.
That's great. Well, this is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, Progressive Radio, 1340 AM, KPTR, and I am talking to author Joseph Wambaugh. At the same time, Joe, you just touched on it briefly. It seemed like you were heading into more nonfiction writing involving crimes that also occurred in other areas. And you mentioned England, which was certainly geographically a far way to go. You did Lines and Shadows in 1984, and that followed the Border Task Force of San Diego. You went to Pennsylvania to research the echoes in darkness. Did you at the time make a conscious decision to concentrate on nonfiction? And if you did, would you tell us why?
Well, I've always enjoyed writing nonfiction. I probably enjoy it more than fiction, but I feel closer to my fiction, I suppose, because it's more from my experience of trying to use my imagination to bring things to life, and that's very, very personal and intimate. In the nonfiction, I'm an investigative reporter, and I'm determined to be accurate. And I get to be a detective again. I get to go talk to people, find out what their version of the facts is, and then try to glean what the real version is, because we all see things through our own prism. And I get to be a detective in that way, to try to ferret out what is real and what isn't, and what's fantasy, and it's very exciting, and I enjoy doing it. And yes, going to those various different geographic areas was a challenge. I can tell you for sure, when I went to England, it was a challenge.
And in England, that's where they first started using the DNA testing, is it not?
Right. They were calling it at that time. It was discovered there at Leicester University by Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a molecular biologist, and it was called he called it genetic fingerprinting. Here in America, we tend to call it DNA typing, something like that.
Right.
In any case, there I was with the man who discovered the procedure. And when the blooding was published here in the States, most of the police officers in America hadn't a clue what DNA typing was all about. The fact that a human being could be identified specifically from all others on the face of the earth on the basis of blood, semen, hair root, bone, tissue. That was amazing. It was simply amazing. I could hardly believe it when I was researching it over there. I can tell you it was not a glamorous investigative reporter's life. I was freezing to death in the middle of an English village in a small inn where I had to put coins in the radiator every month. I'm sorry, every hour to heat the room. And I had to live in that for a couple of weeks. I'd push the bed in the center of the room and cover myself with my overcoat and everything else at night to keep away from the draft, so to survive that. And I thought, the glamorous life of a best-selling author.
Yes, that's true, but you were part of investigative history, and that sure must have been exciting.
It was very exciting, still is. Someday I hope the bloodiness made into a film. I think people would be amazed.
Oh, that's terrific.
At the case, because it was first used in a serial murder over there. And I write about that in the story, how it was first used to catch a serial killer in England.
I'm just going to ask you to talk briefly about The Fire Lover that was published in 2002 that began in South Pasadena. That was quite a book. And it seemed, although it was a crime, like quite a departure from what you normally wrote in the past. Why did you decide to attack that problem?
Well, actually, a reader sent me a video of a documentary that was done at about the time of that series of fires that were set in the foothills over Pasadena, Glendale, Burbank, and then eventually spread all over the Los Angeles area by the same serial arsonist. And I became interested in it, and I contacted some of the guys that worked on the case. It was handled by ATF and by the Los Angeles Fire Department mostly, and I became acquainted with the guys, and there was no secret. The book isn't a whodunit. The serial arsonist, who was later convicted for multiple counts of arson as well as counts of murder, was a very prominent fire captain and arson investigator.
Yes, that was really shocking. How did your readers react to that book?
Well, crime is crime. Even though I wasn't dealing directly with police officers, I had very few complaints from police officers that I sort of abandoned them to write about other kinds of investigators, namely, ATF and in Los Angeles. You may be interested to know that the police do not handle arsons. Arsons in the city of Los Angeles are handled by the fire department.
Right.
So I got to know some wonderful firefighters.
I bet you did. And as I said, it was a great book. Now, Joe, let's talk about the fact that prior to Fire Lover, it had been about 10 years before you came back to the novel form in Los Angeles with Hollywood Station in 2006. Tell us why it was such a long hiatus to get back to fiction in the LA scene.
Well, I sort of had the feeling that I drained my imagination dry and didn't have enough of a creative spark in me to come up with new characters and new stories, and especially new plot lines involving cops. Then I guess one day I got tired of avoiding the task of sitting down and saying, I'm going to write a novel. And I thought, why I just do it the way I do nonfiction, interview people. So you might notice that in the acknowledgement of my Hollywood novels, and now the third one, of course, is coming out in December. There are more than 50 cops in the acknowledgement for each of the 3 books. That's how many interviews it took for me to get my imagination kicked into gear. Along with the wonderful anecdotes that the cops gave me, and along with the wonderful characters that the cops are, it took me 50 for each book to be able to mold them and shape them and turn them into living characters in a novel. And
well,
a story
they're great. All of the characters are great, and I had a wonderful time reading Hollywood Station. In the beginning, there's a very gruesome but effective description involving 2 policemen in a very bloody crime scene. What was the inspiration for it? Did that really happen?
Yes, yes, that bloody crime scene really happened, and I pretty much described it the way it was described to me by the police officers. And that's what I mean by relying on the truth of the events to give me the clay, to shape them into the sculpture. And I needed that clay, and they really gave it to me. The cops are wonderful. Every cop that I acknowledged in those 3 books was just sort of a natural storyteller. I had cop friends of mine pick out good storytellers for me. I always interview them 4 at a time, if possible. And at dinner, over drinks, sometimes, it takes about 2.5 drinks on average to get the average male cop talking, but the female cops are terrific. They just have to smell the cork, and they can really rip.
Well, we don't want to worry our women listeners about that, but that sounds like it was a lot of fun, I'll tell you. One of the final scenes in Hollywood Station included 2 men, a car, and a frustrated guard dog that I thought was brilliant in its choreography. Did that happen also?
No, that one happened in part, but I'll take a little credit for that. Primarily, I wrote it as a screenwriter.
I thought so.
Yes.
I
Yes.
saw the image.
Yes, and I thought if we ever get to shoot that is going to be a wonderful sequence in the film.
Oh, yes. It stole the book. It really did. It was absolutely great. Now, when you began Hollywood Station, did you know that you were going to be doing a series?
No, absolutely not. When I finished Hollywood Station, I thought I was finished with Hollywood Station.
Right.
But somehow I kept thinking of the fun times I had interviewing those cops over drinks and dinner, and thought, why don't I do it again and see what happens? There must be some other aspect of policing in the Hollywood scene that I could deal with, and that's when I came upon the idea of doing Hollywood Crows, about the Community Relations Office, CRO, called Crows by the other cops. They deal with issues that have little or nothing to do with police work. Quality of life issues. They're police officers doing quality of life stuff in Hollywood, and that is a bizarre place to be dealing with the citizenry over quality of life. And that book was a lot of fun.
Well, I imagine so. Now, I have not read that book yet. I'm anxious to read it. Did that follow some of the same characters that were in Hollywood Station?
Yes, this is the first time in my career that I used some of the same characters. So I guess one could call it a sequel. And then the same with the follow-up, Hollywood Moon.
Well, why don't we talk about Hollywood Moon now that you've raised that? How does Hollywood Moon relate to the first 2 books, if at all?
Yeah, some of the same characters come back, so I guess we'll call that a sequel as well.
I think so.
Call all 3 of them my Hollywood trilogy. I don't think there's going to be a Hollywood quartet, but right now I don't think so, but who knows? And some of the same characters come back. I just, a couple of days ago, received a copy of an email sent to my publisher by someone I greatly admire, who said that Hollywood Moon is the best of the 3, and gave it enormous praise, and said that seeing those same characters was like meeting old friends again. And he said that he hoped that I do 6 Hollywood books or 8 Hollywood books, and I was very thrilled because that person was Stephen King.
Wonderful. Well, that has to be absolutely great coming from a writer like that. Well, who knows? Maybe you are going to write another book. And Hollywood Moon, as we talked about, is going to come out in December of this year, and I know everyone is going to be waiting for that. I certainly am. I was really sorry to finish Hollywood Station and didn't have the opportunity to read Hollywood Crows before we talked, but that's going to be my next book. Let's talk a little bit about the Dine and Drinks research sessions that you've been discussing for the Hollywood series with members of the police force. You mentioned differences between the male and female policemen, but were there any differences that you found between the police of your day and the current ones? And if so, would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the police of my day drank more than the police officers of today. The police officers of today are a little more healthy and a little more determined to stay healthy. I notice it even when they order the food, some of them, particularly the women, and they're careful choosing something for their diet and for the heart and all of that. Where back in my day, they just powered down the drinks.
Right.
But I can tell you for sure, and for any other writers who are out there who want to interview police officers, number one, you cannot use a recording device, ever. Police officers are very suspicious of reporters in general. They think that they're just critics, and usually they are. And hence, they fear recording devices. And number two, you mustn't interview the genders together. You must segregate by gender. I interview 4 male cops, 4 female cops, because if you put them together, you're going to encounter the same thing that happens on the playground a lot. The males start getting macho, particularly after a couple of drinks, and start taking over, and the women get resentful and start clamming up. But if you segregate them, particularly with the women, wow, what they will have to say about the men, great stuff. Women are more verbal, and they're not afraid to reveal their emotions. So they give me the stuff of story. They're the best. They're better than the men.
Well, the women police in your book certainly held their own, and I'm sure there's still a lot of that competition back and forth, but I guess they're holding their own now too. Are you meeting a new generation of readers that have discovered your books, and do they differ from your longtime fans? Are there younger people that are finding you?
Yeah, it's all new. It's all new to me today, the publishing business compared to the publishing business I used to know. Well, in the first place, more people in general read. A larger percentage of the population back in the day were readers. And nowadays, as you know, newspapers are shutting down. People aren't reading anymore the way they used to. That is, not reading print. They're reading things on computer screens. And it's not quite the same. So there's a smaller percentage of the population that are as interested in books as there used to be. And I have to deal with that and understand it when I'm talking to the young cops. Back in the day, they cops knew everything that I did. And nowadays they don't necessarily. The cops generally know who I am, the young cops, but they haven't read books very much, just as young people in general have not read books very much these days. That's a big difference, and it's a challenge sometimes.
Well, maybe you'll find yourself on the internet with some of these iBooks that are popping up. We're going to have to take a break pretty soon. What is, very quickly, you've said there's not going to be a 4th book in the series, but are you working on something else right now?
Well, right now, I'd love to find another good nonfiction story where I could go out and be a detective and an investigative reporter again.
You got the bug. You've got the bug. It sounds like it would be a wonderful, wonderful book. But I'm afraid we have to say goodbye. I'd like to thank you so much for being on my first show. Will you come back to talk with me about Hollywood Moon when it's released?
Anytime, Jacqueline. It's been my great pleasure.
Oh, thanks, Joe. Bye-bye.
Bye.